Welcome, everyone. Our agenda for today will begin with a brief introduction to Zoom, followed by Dr. Johonna Turner introducing our guest host and our guest co-host and the guest speaker. After the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers, which will be moderated by our hosts. After the Q&A portion has concluded, Addison will share a few announcements related to the Zehr Institute and the Center for Justice and Peace Building, and then the webinar will be closed out with remarks provided by Dr. Turner. We encourage you to stay for as much of the webinar as you can, but please note that there will be a recording of this webinar posted on the Zehr Institute's website and YouTube channel by early next week if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others. Just a brief disclaimer, we do have a secure platform, but in case of disruption, please do not attempt to exit Zoom. Instead, close your laptop or turn off your device immediately. If this happens, we will resume the webinar again after 10 minutes. For today's webinar, please acquaint yourself with the Q&A button and dialog box that pops up with it. Our hosts will be using that feature to moderate the Q&A portion after the presentation. You will likely see a raise hand feature, but please do not use that as we will not be monitoring it during this presentation. If you're having technical difficulties, please feel free to send me a message using the chat box. Again, the Q&A button and dialog box will be used to ask questions of the presenter, and please use the chat feature to ask any questions regarding the technology or your viewer experience. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. Now I'm going to pass to Dr. Turner to introduce our co-host.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm excited that you're joining us for today's webinar on Revitalizing Indigenous Peacemaking. I'm joining you from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia in the United States, the homeland of Indigenous nations who spoke Iroquois and Algonquin languages, as well as the Manahoac people and the Monacan Nation, who are still here in this valley fighting for reclamation, recognition, and repair. Every day, my feet also touch land on which many peoples labored as captured, exploited, and enslaved workers, including people of African descent, my ancestors. Thank you again for joining us today for this important webinar on Indigenous peacemaking. You will hear about the work of the Indigenous Peacemaking Initiative based at the Native American Rights Fund, which works to support Native peoples in restoring sustainable peacemaking practices through digital archives, training, advocacy, and technical assistance. Joining me as special guest co-host, I'm excited to welcome my dear friend, sister, and very fine colleague, Tala Bautista. Tala is a member of the Sumatra First Nation in Kalinga, Philippines. She is an adjunct faculty member at the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University, and also works as the Chief Operating Officer for Peace Builders Community, a non-governmental organization in the Philippines, and the Senior Vice President of its social enterprise, Coffee for Peace. Welcome, Tala. I'm now going to pass the virtual mic over to you to welcome and introduce our esteemed panelists.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner. Oh, all right. I think I just had a brief internet problem connection there, but thank you so much for introducing me. And it's such a huge privilege to be in this webinar and to introduce our guests. So our guest for today is Brett Lee Shelton. He is a member of the Oglala Sioux tribe and also has Itazipco Lakota and Cheyenne ancestors. His work at the Native American Rights Fund focuses on the Indigenous Peacemaking Initiative, boarding schools, and sacred places. He received his law degree from the Stanford University and a Master of Arts from the University of Kansas. He is currently licensed to practice law in various courts, including California, Colorado, South Dakota, the Oglala Sioux tribe, and the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, as well as several United States courts. Our other guest speaker is Miss Cheryl Demmert Fairbanks. Miss Fairbanks is Tlingit-Tsimpshian and was born in Ketchikan, Alaska. She obtained her BA from Fort Lewis College and her JD from the University of New Mexico. She works as an attorney and Tribal Court of Appeals justice, focusing on tribal-state relations, tribal courts, peacemaking and family conferencing, mediation, family, school, education, and indigenous law. She recently serves as the Walter R. Echo Hawk Distinguished Visiting Professor of Law at Lewis and Clark University in Oregon. Currently, she is the Interim Executive Director of the UNM Native American Budget and Policy Institute. Thank you so much for being with us, and it is a huge honor to be learning from you. And I'm turning the virtual microphone to both of you.
Thank you, Tala. It's good to be here. And Cheryl, do you want to say anything before we cue up the video?
No, just thank you. And we look forward to this afternoon, and especially a big thank you to Johonna for opening this door for us. And we look forward to building a relationship and sharing back and forth. In my language, we say Ganesh Chish. Thank you.
So we thought it would be nice to show a video that the Indigenous Peacemaking Initiative put together, and because it features several peacemakers, so you can hear from the people who've actually done the work a lot themselves and who guide the project about some cases and some reasons why they think it works. So we're ready to roll the video at any point, and then we'll talk to you.
Starting point for me was a 13-year-old girl that appears in court for truancy. And the judge calling her case, the young lady approaches the bench, reads the charge, asks her how she pleads, and she says, guilty. The judge simply says, okay, I'll find you guilty. I'm imposing a fine of $90. You have 90 days to pay that fine. If you do not pay that fine in 90 days, your driver's license will be suspended when you're eligible to get one. That took around 11 seconds. When she came to get her paperwork, I said, young lady, why don't you go to school? She was a young Native girl, maybe 13. And she said, every morning when I wake up, my mother is with a different man, and my friends tease me. That's when I saw that system did not work at all. It took a young girl that was seeking help from a system that's supposed to protect her, and it punished her.
The legal system that we deal with in the United States and wherever else that we have common origins in the legal system is an adversarial system. So the whole goal is basically to put up the best fight. Whoever puts up the most convincing fight wins. Well, neither side really wins a lot of the time because both sides walk away with bruises, right? And if you imagine that the two sides were just individuals trying to work it out, it's kind of like might makes right, or whoever wins the fight wins, right? The problem's not necessarily solved at all in that case. And so you got to question the roots of the doctrine, right? And within tribal communities, and I'd say that, everybody comes from a tribal tradition. They may have forgotten it, but everybody's indigenous to somewhere in their roots. And those people learned how to live together over long periods of time without harming each other irreparably, without walking around with grudges all the time. And so if we look to cultures that are still reflective of their origins, of indigenous cultures, then I think we're going to see a better way of doing things a lot of times. The Native American Rights Fund is the nation's oldest and largest nonprofit law firm devoted to protecting and advancing Indian rights. And so they've been working since the early 1970s to protect all sorts of Indian rights. One of their projects has been the Indigenous Peacemaking Initiative, which started about 1992 at NARF. And since that time, they've been trying to keep their hands in supporting tribal efforts to revive Native dispute resolution processes, typically called peacemaking.
The peacemaking process is about identifying issues, problem solving, and developing common sense consensus solutions that work for people in the community. Community harmony may be at stake beyond individual wellness and healing for individuals and supporting and encouraging people to realize the fullest of their potential and to live their life in a good way. Philosophically, for us Anishinaabe people in Michigan and the Great Lakes area, we call it Mano Benatsoen, and really it means living your life in a good way.
When we do restorative, we use our traditional values, and one of those being love. So in a systems, court systems, those kind of systems, there is no love, and that's a lot of it. But traditional values are what we want to teach our children. Our people that missed out on hearing those because of our effects of boarding school era, that weren't given our traditional values, our stories, our teachings, those kind of things. And today I think when we talk about cultural identity, that's who we are those values. That's what we learn throughout our life.
In Cake, they all know each other. So they all know who the victim is, or they all know who the wrongdoer is, and they know the backstory. Whereas you take them to outside the system, they only see the wrongdoing. They don't even pay attention to the victim, right? So they're not there to fix or to help. So the beauty of Peacemaking Circle is that it's place-based. It should be right in the community and designed by the community members.
We were requested to do a healing circle in a tribal community where there was a murder. A young man killed his father. And we did, and we had 60-some community people in the circle. It lasted roughly 9 hours. But the community got to express their grief, their frustrations, their pain. But the beautiful part of this circle is that the young man that killed his father was allowed to call a cell phone in the circle, his aunt's cell phone, from the jail. And put on speakerphone, he became part of the circle. And it was so enlightening to know that they didn't condone the fact that he killed his father. But they all had positive things to say about this young man. He worked with kids. He was teaching them weaving and different cultural things. And now this community suffers the loss of what they thought would be a future leader, and because he's probably going to be incarcerated for some time. They lost a tribal member who died, and they were very concerned about this. And at one point, this young man said, "Is my grandpa there?" And they said, "Yes, Grandpa's here." And he said, "I love you, Grandpa." And Grandpa said, "I love you too." They'd never spoken those words in their life. And what the community was talking about, he'd done a terrible thing, but he was still a good human being. That young man's re-entry program started that day, and he hadn't even been to court yet.
We are overly represented in so many of the demographics that tear at our heartstrings. And I think if more people had a chance to really connect with their culture, of which peacemaking, Woawahwala Wichoni, is a part of that, that we would deter and put so many people on a completely different trajectory. And right now, the place where peacemaking can happen is through tribal courts.
When I started, this was one of my primary responsibilities that NARF wanted me to pick up and run with, and that's the first time they've devoted serious staff attorney time to advance in the Indigenous Peacemaking Initiative, or IPI. What we've done with that is just try to build it out so that it's there to serve tribal interests. We focus the priorities of the project based on some surveys that we've done of tribal justice system employees and other workers over the years. And what those priorities are first to provide just basically an information bank for tribes where tribes can share information about how they've implemented traditional dispute resolution systems or recovered their previous systems or whatever with other tribes who might be interested in seeing how they did it. Second off, we also provide training if we're qualified. So we have an advisory committee that consists of about a dozen of the leaders in the field of peacemaking who've been doing the work for 30 years or, in some cases, a long time like that. And those people are sometimes available to go out and train other tribal members in how to do stuff, how to do effective peacemaking, and also how to implement peacemaking within an existing system or existing government or judicial structure. And then finally, we provide advocacy when appropriate. So we help to promote peacemaking as a viable option within tribal communities, and then also try to promote the legitimacy and encourage people within the state and federal systems to take tribal dispute resolution systems or traditional cultural dispute resolution systems as something worthy of a lot of consideration, a lot of deference. The decisions that come out are good and solid.
I went through the training, I became a facilitator, and we held a circle in Northway. And what I noticed about it is that they were ready to embrace anything different.
They said, exactly what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to address, first of all, petty offenses. And I wanted to bring people out together to come up with a resolution that everyone could live with, or to make amends to their community. And I asked for their support. And they said, sure, we'll support that. And that's how I got started.
And what I noticed is everybody was enthusiastic. They showed up before, usually people are late. They were early. We had our preacher come. It's like we define what works in our community. And that to me is the beauty of Peacemaking Circle, is we define what works for us.
When I decided early on that I needed to explore more culturally appropriate options for resolving conflicts and disputes in our own tribal community, I was told that I could never do that because in Michigan, tribal people had been so assimilated that we would never know what the traditional law was. Well, even if that's true, we know what the traditional process was. And the process was bringing people together on the circle and trusting the circle to provide the answers as people talk things through.
One day, an elderly man came, and my idea of being a judge is like the way how another non-Inuit would run the proceeding. So this elderly man stood up and raised his hand, wanted to say something. So I told him, you better sit down. And he kept raising his hand. I says, if you don't, I'm gonna, cite you with contempt, for interfering with a judicial proceeding. So he sat down, but I never forgot that experience. And there was many times I thought about, what if I had allowed him to speak? What would he have said? Here's an elderly man who looked like he knew quite a bit about what was going on. And I thought, but if I allowed him to speak, imagine he would have gave some really good pieces of his wisdom, direction. And so this is what I think about the problem, and these are the options we should think about. A Navajo, an elderly man, a man or a woman can say that, even to this day.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully that gives everybody a good background. I suppose one piece that might have been missing from that might be essential to understand. There was one speaker explained that the place where peacemaking can happen is in the tribal courts. And she's familiar with the background, and a lot of people aren't familiar with tribal courts. So just really briefly, I should point out that there's 570 some odd tribes in the United States. About half of them are in Alaska because they're organized a little bit differently up that direction. But pretty much all of the tribes have their own court system. And for the most part, the tribal courts were developed in about the 1930s and 40s, kind of in the same model across the country. They were provided by the United States as part of its relationship with the tribes. And they look a lot like kind of like a municipal court. And at the same time, tribal governments were created by the United States and provided to tribes as well. And those look a lot, they kind of look corporate in their structure. They're again, kind of a cookie cutter, sort of boilerplate option. But because the tribal courts are basically models of what a municipal court might look like, and yet, and all the problems that exist within modern day courts, all the reasons that people are dissatisfied with them, those exist in the same model. They're adversarial systems still, and they're counter to tribal traditions in pretty much a lot of ways. And they don't work there either, and for the same reasons. And they're funded at about a third of the level of what outside courts are too. So they're hamstrung by lack of funding as well. Seeing those problems, tribal people say, well, our people got along for thousands of years before, let's recover what they did and see what we can do with that. And so that's kind of the context that all of this occurs in. Then when thinking about what to talk about, I think it may be most helpful to explain kind of what got me to doing this work, because this is really living my passion, being able to do this work. It's only at NARF that this work could happen the way that it does. And so I was exposed to peacemaking when we had a guest justice from the Navajo Nation Supreme Court, where peacemaking is strong at Navajo Nation, teaching in my law school for 1 year. And he brought the head peacemaker out, who's somebody who's friends with Cheryl, in fact, Phil Bluehouse. And he told us about peacemaking. Now, at the same time, I was involved in, at the time, a really cutting edge year-long mediation course in my law school. Lawyers don't really learn about mediation that deeply, but I really took to it. And then the peacemaking made a lot of sense. Well, fast forward about 5 or 6 years, and I was at my home reservation working in the domestic violence program, helping the survivors. So I was doing a lot of divorces, a lot of child custody, and a lot of orders for protection. And within the adversarial tribal court system, you get really good at what you do after a while. After 10,000 hours, you become an expert at anything, I guess people say. And I spent a lot of time, doing that work on the reservation. At about 4 or 5 years, I could feel burnout coming, but I could also tell that something wasn't feeling right with respect to how I had to handle the cases involving the children. Because if mom wanted to terminate dad's rights, I could usually make the case and I could get dad cut out of the picture almost completely. But something didn't feel good about that. We're all related on the reservation. So sometimes I was doing that to my own relatives too. And at the same time, my tribal nation started developing its own abused and neglected children's code, or children's protection code, based on our traditions, because we had been provided in the 1940s an American model children's code, which just didn't fit at all culturally. And we had plenty of tradition left on our reservation, and the elders had been working for a long time in the community to kind of correct some of the systems that we were dealing with. And one of the first places they wanted to dig into was this, because these were children who were at risk, and we have traditional ways to deal with them that didn't involve mom and dad fighting it out in front of a supposedly neutral third party in court and basically destroying each other in the court in order to see who could win and come out of that thing unscathed, right? That's not best for the kids, and our people realized that. So during that process, it was brought out by elders, and I got to help with writing that code just because I'd been to law school and would listen basically to the elders and so on. And they were really, really strict about the fact that really there's no such thing as parental rights. It's really about parental responsibilities. And if you want to call anything rights, it's that probably you could frame what people owe to the children as children's rights, and things that the society owes to families, both small nuclear families and to extended families, could be called family rights. So you might be able to push it in, take the traditional Lakota concepts. When translating them into English, you could call them rights, but they were going to be children's rights and families' rights. It's not about parental rights, and it's the idea of terminating parental rights just doesn't make sense into a Lakota mind, basically, and in Lakota language, it doesn't make sense. So that really blew it open for me, because I had been basically working to terminate rights as much as possible, if not legally, then at least effectively, by minimizing visitation time and so on with Dad, who had done terrible things a lot of times. I mean, good reason, he had done something wrong and he should be held accountable, but the way I was instructed to work and the way that the system was set up for me to work in, and I got good at, wasn't very healthy in terms of community continuation in a group way. So that's what really blew it open for me, and said, yeah, I've been trained to be a lawyer and work in this system, and I learned how people kind of can check their conscience at the door and buy into the system and say, well, the system's designed to set it right and everything, but no, not really. What was needed in this case was a systemic change that our people had already started doing, and that we were kind of actualizing by enacting that code. And so it was a reawakening into my own tribal culture that made me realize I can just jump into this and do it. So then fast forward again, and this job opened up at NARF when they finally ready to commit serious attorney resources to it. And I'd been a fan all along. So it was a great chance to work with tribal nations around the country and do that. And then also to get to work with people like Cheryl, and there's 12 others besides Cheryl right now on our advisory committee that I get to work with, in addition to other peacemakers all around the country. So I'm living a blessed life right now, and really happy for what I get to do. And with that, I could hand it over to Cheryl, who will share a little bit of her wisdom with us all.
Okay, thank you, Brett. And I really love that video, because it really gives you a perspective from other peacemakers throughout the country. And we've held a series of these colloquiums throughout the country, and as an education piece. So, and thank you for having us here at your institute. So I have a PowerPoint that I'd like to share with you, and we call it Peace Circles, Basket of Wisdom, Weaving Language, Tradition, and Culture, and Justice. And so we're going to ask you to shift, and we use our tribal baskets because the circle is a very powerful symbol for us. And these baskets really have the weave of tribal sovereignty. And so when I ask you to shift, we're shifting to something that's more sacred and spiritual, where everyone has a chance to speak. And in Indian country, silence is really okay. And as you know, with lawyers, if there's a little bit of silence, we're going to jump in there. So it's really getting comfortable with that silence. And we want to have something that's more holistic, so that we can move to health and wellness and healing. And quite frankly, in the American jurisprudence, we never heard that word healing. And for us as Indigenous people, that's very important, given our the historic trauma of our past. And so we want something that's issue focused, where we're gentle on the person and tough on the issue, where we can use our Indigenous wisdom and our own native language. And as Brett said, there's over 570 tribes, and we all have our own languages, our own government, and our own core values. And often with the government, it's like the Indian problem. And we say, no, stop. We really have the Indian solution. And so we want something that's facilitated and focused. And our people, like any people, just want fundamental fairness and the rule of respect, so that we can transition to change. And we want something that is really time honored, that's not rushed, and we're able to use a team approach, and we're able to use our tradition and our culture. And so we've turned around to, sorry about that. We turned around to place value on our traditions, our culture, and our way of life. And quite frankly, as tribal people, we've been looking to the outside for our answers. Why don't we just model after mediation, or why don't we just model after arbitration or federal or state court? And as Brett explained, that really wasn't working for us because we were leaving out our values, we were leaving out our language, we were ignoring our culture and our tradition. So with peacemaking, we're really able to draw upon our tribal values, our tradition, and our laws in a contemporary context. And so I use these guiding principles because as a lawyer and a judge, I felt like I had been facing the wrong way. I'd been looking to the outside for answers, when in fact we had this beautiful circle of knowledge and wisdom within our respective communities. Also, we had to really understand the impact of federal policies as well as state policies, and that impact on us as the Indigenous people of North America. And one thing that we really focus on is the significance of our oral tradition and our native language, and that becomes really the common law of our tribes. To re-educate the educated, many of us have had an American education as well as an internal tribal education, and bringing those two together is important because we're able to take the best of both worlds. And as you know, being schooled in American education, we really have to use that as a tool to really develop systems that are more effective. And so we're calling for consensus, cooperation, comedy, which is really respect and unity. And these are our way of life from my people in Southeast Alaska, along the panhandle there. We're the coastal tribes, and these are our values that our elders have put on a magnet on posters because we were losing them so fast that usually they weren't written, but we had to write them because we were losing them, and we wanted to make sure the next 7 generations would continue affirming them. And one of the main ones is, you know, the respect for self, elders, and others. And of course, to be strong in mind, body, and spirit, and humor. We have our Indian humor that's very healing and kind of dry in a sense. And we like to hold each other up, speak with care. And the last one is Iguyaya Hon, which means be strong and have courage. And these are the values that my law class came up with. And they were very resistant to peacemaking because they have been schooled in American jurisprudence, which is win at all costs, be, you know, and to really be schooled in the adversarial American jurisprudence. And so they came up with these values, and I'm really proud of them, and I wanted to share them with you. And this was a group, I thought they were going to be all Native students, but they weren't. They were very diverse. And it was interesting to see the shift in all of them as they struggled to really look at a process that was more consensus and a process that was more healing. And so they came up with integrity, be true to your word, diligence, warrior spirit, to be brave and confident, stay balanced and happy, and the universal law of respect. And then the humility, the cultural humility of being authentic and being able to say, I'm sorry and thank you. This is the group, and they come from all over the country. Actually, the deans of the law school were there, and tribal and state court judges came to really support the students. And of course, NARF was there, and NIJA, the Native American Tribal Judges Association. And it was really a profound gathering, colloquium. And so when I say we've been facing the wrong way, we had to look at our tribal courts. And one of these law reviews talked about our tribal courts, criticized our tribal courts for being nothing more than pale replications. And I was like angry, and I thought, this could not be. And sure enough, I had to take a look, and we were modeling a lot after the state and tribal, state and federal court, sorry. And then I realized we really had to understand the impact of the failed federal policies, because they really colonized us, and they really assimilated us, and they really terminated our way of life. And these are the policies that we have been subjected to. Of course, before the encounter, our sovereignty was intact, but then there was this removal of our people from our homelands and the forced walks you've heard about. Maybe, for example, the Choctaws in Oklahoma walked all the way from Mississippi. And many of these you may have heard about was the Trail of Tears, where many of our people died and were lost on that trail. And the reservation system was designed to really civilize us as tribal people. And there's really a use of military type of strategies for schooling and how they treated us. There's all these forts that were developed across the nation to hold our people. And the allotment era was really justifying the takeover of the land. And they divided the land into 160 acres and wanted all of us to be farmers. We're fishermen, we're not farmers. Our garden is the sea, but we have our allotments because the federal government, that was one of their policies. And it was really a way to individualize, to shift to individual ownership, when before we had the collective tribal ownership. And then the IRA was really boilerplate constitution, be like the United States Constitution, separation of power. One of the worst eras was the era of termination, which really brought civil and criminal state jurisdiction into Indian country. It enhanced the state role in our lives. We're very regulated, and really resulted in the loss of our language, loss of our children, loss of our culture, and movement to the cities called relocation. They wanted to relocate us into Chicago, San Francisco, Dallas, so we would become assimilated. And then the self-determination era was kind of a bright light of hope, where we became more self-determined and more into the decision making of what was important for us in our governance. And now we're in self-governance, where there's a revitalization of our government's language and culture. This picture speaks for itself. This is the Carlisle Institute, where many of our kids came from all across the nation. And interesting, there's a graveyard on this property where many of our tribal children died, and we're today repatriating them back to give them so that they can have a good journey, and they can be at home and at peace. And so this has really resulted in the breakdown of the family, and the breakdown of and the forced removal. And today we're still removing kids at the border. As you can tell, we haven't learned the lesson in America how this forced removal has high consequences, because now, because we've been raised in institutions, we have a high number of child abuse cases and domestic violence. And so when I say that language is important, my dad always said, if you have the language, you have the law. And right now we're in the process of really revitalizing our sacred circles where elders are valued and our oral tradition is honored. And when I say re-educate the educated, it's a time to pause and rethink our systems. And this American education will be the greatest tool for the protection and strengthening of our sovereignty. And I bring up the policies so that we never replicate those failed termination and assimilation policies. And so I'm going to share the weave of this language, tradition, and culture. And there's a lot of power in the circle. So our peacemaking is held in circles. And the gathering in a circle is very powerful because it really allows us to experience each other as equals. We're all in a circle. No one is higher than the other. And the group becomes united. And the parties that take the people in the circle participate, and the energy really forms to build resolution. It's very much synergistic. And face to face, it's like ripples of water bringing about change. And we use the basket as a talking tool. And I have my baskets handy. We always, you can only talk when you have the basket. And the basket brings the respect and presence of the tribe. There's a lot of tears and laughter in that basket. It's symmetrical. It really is the mind, body, and spirit of the weaver, and it carries the tradition of the tribe. And it's very empowering. My grandmother was a weaver, and she always said to us, you're the design, and each part of the weave is important to the whole. Without you, it's flawed. And so we need that collective wisdom, that wholeness is an important part, that symmetry. And so these, on the left is the process, on the right are the guidelines. The process, of course, is a circle, opening with prayer. I've tried it with prayer. I've tried it without prayer. Guess what works? Prayer. And then we have different rounds for clarification and for understanding what the issue is. And there's all kinds of circles. It could be a celebration circle. It could be an issued circle. It could be a healing circle. It could be a community circle. But the guidelines on the right are really important, the rule of respect. And one that we had to really emphasize is agree to disagree. Because when we were doing circles, people were afraid to disagree because it was a peace circle. But we put that in there so that we would gain clarity on really what the issues are, and we would be able to build off of each other's participation. And listening is very important. Apologies and forgiveness are important, and passing is also okay. One of the peacemakers is called the Itikanekbi. It's out in Choctaw, Mississippi. And their Itikanekbi is their Choctaw word, and it's established by tribal ordinance as a separate court. And I show this chart to kind of show the differences in approach. Chata-okla is a Choctaw word, and it really goes to community and wholeness. In America, the jurisprudence is really on individualism, I, me. In Choctaw, Itibaka Chafa really goes to cooperation, collaboration. In American jurisprudence, it's really competition. I win, you lose. I win at all costs. So it's a real win-lose system. Itihalalia goes to relatedness. We're all related, and we really work hard to preserve that relationship. In American jurisprudence, it really goes to autonomy, separation of the child from the family, separation of powers. We really go to more balance and the relatedness. This case I would like to share with you. The gentleman in the blue is a peacemaker, and the an attorney, but as a law student, he really was resistant to peacemaking because he was schooled in the adversarial method, and that's why he went to law school. The woman in the middle is an adoptee. She was adopted by non-Indian people at birth, and the individuals to her left and right are her paternal aunties. And Jay, as resistant as he was, we decided, since he spoke the language, we went out to Dene, to the Navajo, and we had a peacemaking to reunite this adoptee with her family. And they used their Navajo language, their Dene language. They used the peacemaking principles, and we were able to reunite her with her aunties. We were able to get her tribal membership, citizenship at the tribe, and she had health issues. So she was able to help understand why she was having her health issues. And now she has many, many relatives. Another model I'd like to share with you is the Washtenaw County Peacemaking Court. This is a state court model that really used tribal principles and gives credit to tribal principles, building on relationships, responsibility, respect, and redirection. And it's a state court model that was created to replace the limitations of an adversarial system. And it really moves to integrating the repairing of harm and the healing of relationships, and really goes to restoration. And with our weave, with our baskets, we really focus on love, loyalty, and generosity. So I say that the law often does not have an answer or solution for every situation, and not all situations belong in court. Let us shift to our ways, our language, using our culture and tradition. These are peacemakers throughout the country, from all over the country. We gathered in Texas. The senior peacemaker on the left is wearing, and the woman on the right is at on the Supreme Court in Texas. And they were able to really model that government to government relationship. And Casey family gave them baby blankets so that they would keep the focus on our children. Our children are sacred, and we have to really develop systems so that we are able to impact 7 generations beyond. And also the United Nations, UNDRIP, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, really reaffirms the right of access to just and fair procedures using our custom, traditions, and rules and our own legal system. I say sovereignty begins at home. There's a lot we can do at home to bring peace. Peacemaking is an option. It provides for healing, restoration, consensus, listening, and really a way to honor our values. My dad always said, if the women are taken care of, the children will be. And you can be an agent of change and have that ripple effect. These individuals at our community on Prince of Wales Island, they've had a ripple effect as they use this canoe is one of our highest forms of peacemaking, because they all have to work together. They all have to work in unity. And I say thank you, Ganesh Chish. And I leave you with these words from my language, Tlingit, Iguayahuan, which means I should have courage, and you, Yiguayahuan, we all together should have collective courage to make a difference. Thank you, and I want to invite you to our Peacemaking Colloquium, which is scheduled for September 28th, 29th, and 30th of this year, and where we're going to be weaving our intergenerational wisdom and healing into the future. And thank you. And I believe we'll stand for questions now.
Well, thank you so much, Cheryl, Brett, Gunashchish. Thank you very, very much for what you have shared with us thus far. It's so powerful, not only what you shared, but the way that you've shared it, Brett. I'm so grateful for how you anchored us, not only in context, but your own story. And also, Cheryl, how you brought us to this history is so important, but also kept returning to the beauty and the lessons in the basket weave and weaving in the teachings from your dad, from your grandma. You are the design, and how you wove all of this together into it as a way of giving us such a powerful image of the reasons for Indigenous peacemaking and also what it entails. I'm so grateful for that. Tala, would you like to share some initial responses?
Yeah, Cheryl and Beth, thank you so much for that wonderful time of learning with you. I very much appreciated how you shared not just the process of it, but how you shared the stories, the the present and historical context of it. Why is it needed? And I also deeply appreciate how you emphasize the values that are pushing this process, that makes this process work. Because yeah, even if we copy it exactly right, even if we copy peacemaking right, if the values are not there, it wouldn't work as well. And so I really appreciate the way you shared and the way you just taught us today. And yeah, is this like the time for a question? Yeah, I think I was just struck. I was struck a lot of things, and if we have a 10-hour session, I'll be so happy to just sit there and ask you many questions. But the first one is that you mentioned re-educating the educated, and uh, yeah, it that just resonated with me so much, and I would, if you would want to share how you do it and how it is being accepted by, or how it is, how are your people, especially the educated in the traditional academic setting, how do they engage with it, with that concept?
Well, it's kind of a fascinating concept because we've had to live it, Brett and myself and the other peacemakers, and we've had to really go through the American education system, and often at the termination of our own. So in our own healing, and the kind of wisdom we're talking about can't be replicated at Harvard or Stanford or University of New Mexico or Lewis and Clark. It's a special body of wisdom and law and culture through our language. And so when we say re-educate the educated, we ourselves had to pause and think about, yeah, education was a way to assimilate, and American education was a way to assimilate and terminate us. Now we can use that as a lawyer. I know the American system. I'm schooled in the American system. I practiced law in the American system for over 30 years, and I recognize the limitations of that system and how it wasn't working for us as the Indigenous people, because a lot of our people are incarcerated. A lot of our people have problems, issues, and this pandemic has only magnified those conditions. And so we ourselves had to pause and use our education to the benefit of our own people, not just to keep on the colonizing pattern of more of the same, more assimilation, more termination. And so that revitalization, and it's hard. I mean, it's challenging to us because we're colonized. We revert right back to the Western system in a flash. So that's been part of our healing. And I'll yield to Brett to give his input.
It's really similar, I think. I mean, this point was best illustrated, I think, in my own story, right? I mean, I got to be really good at doing the domestic violence cases that I did, but that wasn't serving the people in the way that I wanted, including the children that I was supposed to be looking after the interest of. And so while I strove initially to be good at the system I had been trained to work in, upon further reflection, I realized that that system wasn't the right fit, and that I would be more effective and find more meaning and meaningful impact in my life were I to work on systemic changes. And so now I find myself, for the most part, using what I learned in law school to create space for Native people to actually recover and live the lives that they've lived for millennia. I keep coming across this quote from Krishnamurti lately, and it just really resonates for me, and it does in this situation too. He said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." So as good as I might have been within the adversarial legal system in my tribal courts at home, that's not the best measure of health and of a good life to me. And that's what I realized over time. And so I had to become re-educated. I need to take the time, and I'm grateful for the elders who sat with us for 3 years as we rewrote the child welfare code at home, because they would talk in Lakota. We couldn't understand as deeply as they could. They were native speakers. They would talk things over in Lakota and then translate it out to us. Sometimes they would pause to translate a certain to confer between themselves the best way to translate. It's a whole different translation than you would normally get. But if anybody speaks a different language, you'll realize that the world's different through that lens. And if you speak something other than a language that's a major contributor to English, then you really see a different world through that language as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Johonna.
I just want to, before asking another question, share with those of you who have joined us as guests that we're going to, Tala and I will spend a few more minutes engaging our presenters, but we want to invite you to be gathering your own questions, because we're going to open up for your questions, and you will put them in the Q&A. We'll put those directions up in just a few moments. But I'm thinking about the diversity that you emphasize of Indigenous peacemaking practices. And I'm thinking about also the approaches, Brett, that you shared with us of the Indigenous Peacemaking Initiative's activities. And one is this information bank for tribes. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the information bank. What does it consist of? How does information go there? Are there a variety of, are there stories? Are they processes? Can you kind of talk a little bit more about that bank? Where does it exist? How do people engage with it?
It exists online at peacemaking.narf.org. And it started out as primarily a collection of tribal codes that authorize and try to regulate peacemaking processes within a tribal jurisdiction. But then quickly it became a lot more too. There's some curated resources on peacemaking there meant for tribal folks who want to look at what they're doing. And then it became really clear to me that a lot about peacemaking is really an Indigenous process and not necessarily a Native American tribe process. And because it's worldwide. In fact, talking with Tala when we first met, it sounds like some of these processes are really familiar to her. I just saw the film Fumble Talk about a guy who was doing peacemaking basically in Sierra Leone after their strife and revolution there. It's the same process. And I think it's a human process to sit in a circle and talk things through, and that we start to lose that or leave it behind when there's a colonial power involved, or maybe some churches who try to become political movements rather than spiritual movements. They seem to upset the balance then too. Whenever you start to impose a hierarchy, basically, then you lose the equity and equality of sitting in a circle across from one another. And okay, so back to the internet resources. You got me going down a tunnel there. Sorry. Back to the internet resources. We've got some articles and books on there. We have some featured stuff on Ho'oponopono, which is a Hawaiian style of peacemaking. Very similar, again, Native Hawaiians, but it's of course with their own culture, their own flavor in their own locality. That's pretty well preserved. I like that one a lot. And you see a lot of kind of new age fakery around Ho'oponopono lately, to where there's this one system names 4 statements: I love you, forgive me, please, whatever. That kind of stuff is just kind of the adoption and mutation of something into something that it's not. It's rootless, and so it's really neat to have sources of the legitimate thing there. And so resources like that, I mean, there's the lawyering stuff that goes into it, just kind of making stuff available for anybody who might really need it. We also try to keep current events going on. So if there's upcoming events that people would be interested in attending, if they're interested in peacemaking, we try to post that and so on too. And it's open to anybody. Just go online and check it out. Feel free.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about the power of that quote that you shared. I think it struck a number of us. The quote that you shared about it is not a measure of health to be adjusted to a profoundly ill society. And I'm also thinking about how that connects to worldview. And Tala, I saw you nodding vigorously when there were some mentions of worldview, and we also had a conversation about this among all of us. So Tala, I'm wondering if you want to respond or ask about worldview and the relationship to worldview in this universe of conversation.
Yeah, as was they also mentioned it in the presentation of the importance of um going into that worldview that our communities have in relation to actually to everything, even in peacemaking. And I was wondering, aside or more than the values that was stated, would you have something to share about the worldviews that, or the worldview that made it possible for you to have those values, and that made it possible for you to come up with or to revitalize this peacemaking process?
Um, I'll just add a couple things. One is with the worldview. It's kind of a challenge for us, to really look at the worldview, because that's what's been put upon us forever. And so just struggling to have the Choctaw view or the Lakota view, Tlingit view, Dene view, and to revitalize that view is important. And we're doing it through a peacemaking model. And I think what we can share is this process is so simplistic, and it doesn't have to be complex and complicated. And I think that's what's really appealing to the world, and our voice. We've been at the table as Indigenous people, but our voice has not been heard. And that's the equity that we're working toward, is that, yeah, we're at the table, but someone has always spoken for us, or we've been marginalized so much that we become invisible. And, it's those Indians, and it's through building alliances like what we're doing with Johonna, with restorative and transformative justice. Not always were we there to build this alliance, because we were so protective of our peacemaking, and people exploiting it and using it as theirs, and putting the new age to it and saying, oh, this is new, this is, when in fact it's an old process that we've used. So that's kind of my very limited thing on worldview, but I think the importance of it is we can be at the table to share, because at this point in our history and what's happening in our country, like last night, for God's sake, I was appalled. I was in tears thinking about that. And I even called my kids to say, be careful, because our statistics don't get on the news, and we're marginalized, and our statistics are worse than the Black Lives Matter statistics, but they're not often known. And so I think this worldview really goes to our values of universal respect, that law of universal respect that was taught to me by my grandma. I'll yield to Brett. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So thinking in terms of worldview, I find myself talking a lot lately about the idea of rights, which is pretty central to American thinking. We get all protective of our rights. We want to vindicate our rights. We get bent out of shape if we think somebody transgresses our rights. And I mentioned before that the concept of rights, we dealt with in Lakota didn't even exist really. And you find more and more Native thinkers bringing that forward, that the idea of rights is a little bit foreign and it seems to come from a hierarchy. In fact, I think rights are probably dispensed from the sovereign in most cases, and we go to a sovereign to enforce the rights. Whereas in Indigenous worldviews, I think the 4 R's that are coming out most commonly are respect, relationships, reciprocity, and responsibility. So you really interact with the world based on those 4 R's rather than from a scheme of rights. And there again, and that worldview is kind of, it comes from a lifestyle that values sustainability. We had to keep living in the places where we lived for thousands of years for another thousands of years, versus the other viewpoint, the other worldview that's based on basically controlling nature rather than living with it, learning how to live with it and interact with it sustainably. And it's that the other worldview is premised on infinite growth, basically, which is not true. I mean, there's only so much world, and we can't keep using it. It's been propped up artificially, I would say, by tech fixes, or with the idea that eventually, when things get tight, there will be scientific innovation that will prop it up again and save us. But eventually the resources all run out, or we spoil the nest so completely that we can't live here anymore. So those are the conflicting worldviews. I increasingly the last couple of years find myself pointing out that they're probably 80 degrees different and in opposition, and that we need to choose the way that natives were living before. We need to make a choice overall, because time's running out on a lot of this stuff. I think it sure seems to be.
This is such a rich conversation you all are sharing so profoundly. I'm really enjoying and appreciating what you all are sharing here. We have some questions, and I'm actually going to start with the one that just came in because it directly connects to what you just shared, and then we're going to go to the ones that came in earlier. One guest says, I like your description of the 4 R's. This is from Wayne Marriott, who's joining us all the way from New Zealand and is one of our alumni from CJP. So thank you so much for being here, Wayne. Once again, says, I like your description of the 4 R's. Could you please give further commentary on reciprocity and how this might relate to processes of decolonization?
So, one of the best explanations of the 4 R's that I've heard, this is really common among Native thinkers who are out there. One of the best explanations I've heard is from Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. I highly recommend that book to anybody. She's a botanist who's also steeped in 2 different tribal traditions, and she lectures. She's a PhD and she teaches, so she's really used to the interface between the different tribal traditions and the non-native students as well. So there's a lot, it's really rich, and it's a huge book, so there's a lot in there too. But the reciprocity is more of a native way of interaction. So the Anglo-American, we'll call it, system is based on basically appropriation of things from nature, and you put them to good use essentially in order for them to have value. Whereas you don't interact with anybody or anything without a notion of reciprocity from a native worldview. So for example, is tightly tied in with responsibility and respect as well. For example, there may be a medicinal property that one could get from some leaves that grow on a certain tree, right? Well, in the Anglo-American world, I discover that, and then I claim right to that discovery via patent, which is set up to basically commercialize it and to throw it into the general good of the public eventually after I profit for a few years. That's just weird from a native viewpoint. From a native viewpoint, it's all about that tree has a certain gift to give us, And in order for us to receive that, we have a responsibility to that tree. We owe the respect to that tree to undertake that responsibility before we're even allowed to interact. So I may know that those leaves do that, but I don't get to even take those leaves until I take on the responsibility of learning all of what I need to do to interact with the tree for that specific purpose. So to use that medicine, I need to take on the responsibility and learn. And that responsibility will almost invariably, I would say, include reciprocity in prayer towards the tree, gratitude towards the tree, and the same with interacting with people and so on. There's just constant reciprocity. That's just the way you see the world, and is give and take together. They come together as a sharing, basically. It's part of what you see represented as kind of a stereotypical Indigenous value of sharing, but in fact, Indigenous people do share a lot. They give things back and forth, and that's because of the value of reciprocity as a core value. So even to trees, even to rocks, in addition to humans and other animate animals.
Thank you so much, Brett. Oh, Cheryl, would you want to answer more further?
I think when I think of reciprocity, I think of sharing, like Brett said, and that's one of our most valued, our values is sharing, but the exploitation enters into it. And so, you know, we find ourselves in this protection mode a little bit, maybe sometimes overreacting, but I think it goes to building the trust, and being at that table so that we can learn from each other and we can take the best in terms of sharing it, you know, because we're in a diverse, populated country, and the more we can share and learn from each other, the better chance of arriving at some peace. So thank you.
Thank you so much for both. While both of you are talking, I can feel just my body responding to you both. Like it's just like there's this tiny whisper, like, "Hey, it seems you have forgotten that." You know, like where you're talking about rights and reciprocity, and it's such a beautiful. I can feel my body physically responding to it, and just it's as if it's my cells are saying, "Remember." So thank you for reminding me that. There's another question here on the Q&A. Uh, I think I'll go to the first one and then come back. It says, "Oh, please clarify whether or how fully the peacemaking courts are displacing the criminal legal system in these communities. How much of this work is diversion or sentencing guidance? Can all cases be handled this way, or is it focused on minor crime to youth and or to prevention?"
Big question. Cheryl, would you like to go first?
Well, you know, that's a tough question because jurisdiction is a jurisdictional maze in Indian country. And so you'll find the federal government stepping in on felonies, basically. And so a lot of our tribal court jurisdiction is limited to misdemeanor crimes. But we're making some progress. And Brett and I are going to be working with a tribe where we're looking at probation. Can we deal with probation in a peace circle so our people aren't just breaking probation, then getting smack into the incarceration in prison? And so we're using that, not just, we're also using deferred sentencing. So they'll go through the adversarial system and say they're sentenced to 60 days in jail and a $300 fine. We can defer that sentence, go into a peacemaking circle where it's more therapeutic. And if that person completes the therapeutic plan, which might include treatment, forgiveness, whatever the circle comes up with, then his sentence is suspended, his fine is suspended and deferred. And if he completes it, it's expunged. And so, it's a work in progress, I guess, because we've been colonized. A lot of our people would rather see the bench with the black robe and the gavel. And so, you know, we're working it.
And then let's say the extent to which peacemaking is employed in tribal communities, in addition to everything Cheryl said, which is really spot on. Funding's also a problem, because how do you set up a parallel system when your court system is already funded at a third of what other courts are funded at, more or less, right? So that's a big issue. And so what tribes have to do to get training and to get infrastructure set up and everything is find other money generally, or take money from current court budgets. So that's a problem, but they still do. And what they end up doing is starting a program small generally so that they can make it work, and then expanding. And it's up to the local people or whoever's really driving it. It takes a few champions in a community to make it work, people committed and who are going to move it forward. They will generally pick certain areas and to work in first, and those are the most important areas. What I see time and time again is tribes wanting to deal with child welfare decisions where a child is in risk of being taken and outplaced, and where the extended family and other community members will have a vested interest in what happens with the child as well. So why not bring a circle instead of bring the rules of evidence and exclusion and so on? And then the other place where tribes like to bring it a lot of times, bring the processes forward a lot of times, is in juvenile offenders, where you have a young person who's made a mistake. Probably you don't want to label them as a criminal. Probably you don't want to ruin whatever it is that's going wrong in their life further by putting them into some sort of incarceration. And instead, maybe take a harder look at the extended relationships around that person and see what's been missing and what can help to make them make better choices in their life. So those are the two areas that, for the most part, tribes want to work in. Probation is another close second to those, and then also strangely probate. But that's a case where somebody passes on, and what do you do with their stuff, and particularly their land? And I guess that families fight a lot in that situation, and tribes probably don't want to see the fighting go on over the real estate, essentially, and the other things. But that one was always a surprise to me, but it does come up from time to time. Yeah, that's good. That's good for that question, I think.
Thank you, Brett. You also answered one of the questions I was going to ask, which was, from doing this work for many years, what has been surprising? Cheryl, I might come back and ask you that question later. I give you an opportunity to both to share on that, but I'm going to first go to a question that has been shared from those joining us. We have with us our dear friend and colleague of Tala and I, Katie Mansfield, who first offers gratitude for all of the wisdom and the stories and the love and the humor that you've shared, and also has a question. Cheryl, when you were talking about circle process and values, you mentioned apology. So Katie's question is about apology. Katie remarks that often apologies can feel shallow, both for interpersonal harms and historic harms. Can you share a bit more about how you think about apology?
Okay. Apology is really valued in Indian country, and forgiveness. And when you're setting, I didn't go through it on that chart, but we always set the sacred space. And by setting the sacred space, we open with prayer, and there's a whole spiritual element to our circles, which really makes it different than, say, mediation or arbitration. And often that's done in our language. And our language is really our medicine for healing. And it's a very, very healing. It's not sharp. And so as you're setting the sacred space in the circle, you're making room for apologies. And when you're setting that sacred space and you're holding that basket, I'm going to get one of the baskets here. These are woven baskets. And here's one, and here's the other. This has a little piece of sweetgrass on it. And when you have our sacred objects, you have this basket, and it's holding the sovereignty, the tears, laughter, the the healing of the tribe, you're very careful with what you say, because we're all connected to each other. We're all related to each other. And whenever you have that, we don't fade into the anonymity of Chicago or Dallas or San Francisco. We're going to see each other at the grocery store, at the post office, at school, at church. And whenever you're holding the sacred basket with the sweetgrass, Brett was talking about the braid of sweetgrass. This is some medicine. And then in this basket is also a little bundle that was given to me, wrapped for prayers. And you're holding this and you're really creating that sacred space, because when you have that continuing relationship, there's that authenticity and there's that keeping to your word. And that's really humbling yourself and saying, I'm sorry, in front of your family, in front of your community members. And it's that authenticity of the apology that's going to come through. And if it's not, someone will probably call you on it and say, I don't understand it. And did you really mean it? I'll use one example where we were dealing with a juvenile, and he just said, this basket is nothing but an effing whatever. You know, he was not going to apologize or own up to his responsibilities and his actions. And the peacemaker suspended the session and just said, stop it. You're going out, and I want you two to talk to him about what his disrespect, and explain to him, how we are as tribal people, the respect we have for each other. And so that recess, the Hawaiians call put it in the shade. And so you're letting the emotion drain down, and you're mitigating that. We call it be tough on the issue, gentle on the person, because he was an angry kid. He had a lot of issues. And to expect him just to come into the circle and be, roses and, it's not going to happen. And so that recess, putting it in the shade, helped. He came back, and you know what? He took the basket and he apologized, and you could hear it in his voice, in his action, and he really meant it. It wasn't forced. So there's that sacredness and that spirituality in the circle that's probably missing. And I've done mediation, and there's no comparison. And it's that sacredness that's really brought in by our ways, and usually there are some really important people in that circle that you may not know are very holy and very prestigious in terms of their role in the community, and just their presence in that circle brings a sacredness and respect. I'll yield to Brett.
So lately on this topic, I've heard a lot of traditional thinking people explain that apology is really for the transgressor. And that seemed a little bit confusing to me, right? It's the wrongdoer who benefits from the apology. But I think, the issue around apology is that sometimes they're not authentic and sometimes they are, and it's the authentic apology that we're after. And when somebody does an authentic apology, then they're accepting responsibility for their actions, that they actually did that and it was harmful. And I think that's what the other side wants to see somehow. So I'm not sure where to go with what I'm still learning. But there is an aspect of which that's when their healing starts, when they actually admit responsibility for what they did and that they did something. And so there's truth in there. And I just haven't had time to talk with any about what does it look like in native languages and all of that too. But then when I do think about stuff we're taught where I'm from, one of the big things people always say when you have issues with someone is that you have to forgive them. And that's your responsibility. And that's the only way you're ever going to heal is if you forgive them. So that does kind of correspond to, I as the one who's been hurt have forgiveness to work with, and I need to forgive in order to start to heal. That's what I do for myself, is learn to forgive. Whereas they may need to learn to authentically apologize, which is something about like taking responsibility. So I think that's true, because if you harbor bad feelings from something that somebody did to you, then you get sick. then you get diseases down the line. And so if you're not able to release it, then it has bad consequences for you. So that's, I think, part of our human learning that we don't learn in the English speaking world very well anyway. And I'm seeing that recur in different tribal cultures as I've worked with more and more too. It's been coming to me from the Pacific lately too. I've seen it in Pacific cultures as well as Native American and Canadian Aboriginal cultures. So I think there's something to it. I just don't know exactly where it all goes. That's just where I'm at now on that one.
Thank you so much. Yeah, actually, as you were talking, I also just reflected there's no apology in our language either.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and the way that you just said that apology is something that's it's a responsibility, and that just, yeah, I remember that being practiced. Um and now we're going to the last two questions, and they are similar, and it's about, I'm sorry, let me just, it froze a little while there. But the two questions, they are both asking, can you offer a bit of guidance to non-Indigenous peoples about how to learn and to honor Indigenous ways without appropriating what is not ours and what we don't know? And this is also connected to the second question, which who is also thanking you for the wisdom and the stories you have shared. And can you speak more about your views of others implementing these practices and assuming it is done well and honoring Indigenous values and crediting the gift of where the practices came from? So yeah, what can you share to people who are not from your community in practicing these values or process?
I think we say, if you sing our song, make sure you say our name. And that's giving credit where credit is due. And I think I heard you say there was was there some Maori people on, or people from New Zealand? Yes?
I saw some Maori words coming up in the chat. So somebody's
Yeah, and I just wanted to say goodness cheese to them, because we've learned a lot from them and their Indigenous ways. And I wanted to honor them and say thank you. But I'll yield to Brett on that cultural appropriation question.
Man, that's a really tough one for me right now. We just had a convening of peacemakers from across the U.S. and Canada, like from all over in North America, really, except for Mexico and Central, talking about that, and more to come. I think it's a human process, and it's nobody really owns it. There's some problems, like there's a what do I say? There's an author in the field who credits certain elders from a certain tribe, and who it looks like those people are never granted permission. And they'd say, this isn't ours to grant permission for somebody to write about and make a living off of and all of that. It just feels wrong. It feels like a theft. And it's also like a misrepresentation, because it doesn't belong to any individuals to give to others. But there still is the value of sharing, and there's the value of, we need to recover and implement native ways of living sustainably when those were attempted to have been wiped out, and yet because they threatened the colonizing system, and they need to come back to the fore because they're the ways of living that are sustainable in the big picture. So there's full realization of that in the communities, and there's still that value of sharing, and yet there's hurt feeling. There's a lot of hurt, and there's this tendency by the Western world to come and take everything that's native, reduce it to something that's can create profit of some sort or another, even if that's just academic careers where you get a good job because you publish about us, whatever it is, and to profit from it and then walk away regardless of implications and so on. And so something feels like you're being used by all of that, but You know, so people are sitting in this tension basically. But in the end, the world keeps ticking and saying that we need to move these things forward. That we need to bring these ways back into more prominence. So, you know, I don't have an answer, but that's what's going on with all of that. And I don't have tips for people who would be allies on how to be a good ally. I've been trying to learn because we get that question so much. Recently, I've heard from a really good friend that there's a book called Waking Up White and Finding Myself in a Story of Race, or something like just like that. And that's supposed to be a good book for non-native type allies, or white allies, basically, because of certain things about way of life that people don't realize that they're perpetuating, you know, that they received in their acculturation within this system. That's it. I don't really know what to do. And I work with Native communities all the time. So that's not my area of expertise either. We're on life support out on the reservations, and we're on life support, as are our cultures, because of the influx of TV and everything else. And so there's people desperately trying to keep our ways of living alive because they give life moving forward. And so that's what I'm putting my effort into, and everybody needs to follow their own path for their vocation and their best heart and their soul. So.
Thank you, Brett. Because they give life, it reminds me of Justice Yazi's article, Life Comes from It. Like Tala said earlier, I could just listen to you both for hours. And I am really sad that I am truly sad that our time is up for our webinar. I do ask that those of you who are joining us, please stay for a few more minutes because we're going to have some announcements, and then we're gonna come back and give our panelists the final word, final closing comments. But before we shift to announcements, Brett and Cheryl, I just want to thank you so much for the wisdom, the expertise, the information that you've shared with us. And thank you, Tala, for co-hosting. I'm now going to pass it back to Maggie and Addison, our graduate assistants with the Zehr Institute, to give some announcements of what's going on with the Zehr Institute and CJP. And then we're going to pass it back to you all for some final closing comments.
Hello, everyone. I just want to say that I feel really lucky and grateful to have been here today and gotten to hear wisdom about the processes from people that have really been a part of them. And so just thank you. And now I will give just a few announcements. So our next webinar is called Listening to the Movement, New Growth and New Challenges in Restorative Justice. And it's in April, and you can visit the zehrinstitute.org or to register for the upcoming webinars. The Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, otherwise known as STAR program, is designed for individuals and organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations dealing with current or historic trauma. Currently, all STAR trainings are scheduled to meet online. A level 1 and level 2 course will be available through the Summer Peacebuilding Institute starting May 17th. Visit emu.edu/CJP/STAR to get more information and register for upcoming sessions. If you're interested in learning more about restorative justice, we have several opportunities for you to study at Eastern Mennonite University through graduate degrees and certificates, such as the Restorative Justice Graduate Certificate, which is perfect for working professionals. EMU also offers studies that combine restorative justice and education, or RJE. Students pursuing a master's in education can get a restorative justice in education concentration, or similar to the previous slide, a graduate certificate is also available for those interested in RJE. There's also master's degrees in conflict transformation, restorative justice, and the newly added program for transformational leadership. The curriculum is practice-based and ideal for individuals looking to be reflective practitioners within their chosen field. For more information, visit emu.edu/CJP/grad. Last but not least, the Zehr Institute website is available as a source for upcoming events, resources, the schedule of upcoming webinars, and a repository for past webinars that are linked to YouTube. The recording for tonight's webinar will be available early next week. That concludes my announcements. So here's Johonna with a few closing comments.
My closing comments, I'm actually gonna defer to Cheryl and Brett, but let me first just say, Tala, Brett, Cheryl, it is truly my honor to be in community with all of you. Thank you so much for what you've shared with us this evening. And I pass it to you for closing comments.
Cheryl, would you like me to go first?
Okay.
Okay. Probably for closing comments, I'll just say something that we've been hearing the peacemakers say a lot lately. They've been pointing out how peacemaking isn't really just dispute resolution. It's not supplanting the courts. It's actually a way of life. And it makes sense in native languages. And there's peacemakers starting to write about it in English. And so watch for nice things there, but it's just true. I talked about the competing worldviews, and if you think about the worldviews, think about what the alternative worldview that I presented to you does with respect to your relationship to this earth and to each other as humans too, right? If we would all observe the primacy of relationships, the importance and the respect and reciprocity, we would be a lot better. And so you can see the truth already in what they're saying, that peacemaking is a way of life. And that's how it's encoded in the tribal languages, because the people just sat in a circle and dealt with what came up. It wasn't a formal ceremony. There was sacredness to it, like Cheryl described it, because they observed that important way of being in their life when prayer was everyday, part of every life, really. And so it makes perfect sense, and more of it coming forward. But I wanted to plant that seed for everybody right now, because I think it helps us all to move forward, to look for ways to be more peaceful in our life overall. So.
Thank you, Brett. And a special thanks to Brett for keeping us all united across the nation, because as tribal people, we're all uniquely different, and the geographics can sometimes, hinder our collective cooperation. And then to you all for sharing with us and for inviting us. And I think I thought about sovereignty begins at home, that there's a lot we can do at home to make a difference. And I think that goes for peace too. Peace really begins at home. And I have to find peace within myself. And if I can do that, finding the peace within myself, I think I'll be able to share that peace with others, and that will have the ripple effect. And so I say peace begins at home. Find the peace within yourself so that you can share that with others, and one ripple at a time. Ganesh Chish, Iguaya Juan, have the courage to keep moving forward.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Ganesh Chish.